Ladies and gentlemen, this afternoon, in fact, at the SDG Summit, we have with us none other than Shri Montek Singh Ahluwalia, the renowned Indian economist and civil servant, former Deputy Chairman, Planning Commission of India. And I think it's an absolute honor and delight to have you with us here this afternoon, sir. Thank you so much for joining us. If I could also please request Mr. Abhishek Bhatia, Managing Director and Partner, Boston Consulting Group, along with the renowned Shri Montek Singh Ahluwalia, to please come on stage. If I could invite both of you, sir, to please come on stage and let's gather India's narrative as we're detailing the transition to net zero. Ladies and gentlemen, Shri Montek Singh Ahluwalia, can we have a dynamic round of applause to welcome the dynamic leader himself? I know this is that time of the afternoon, but we'll continue getting some more food for thought, some more relevant food for thought, and let this discussion only begin. With that, Abhishek, over to you.
Thank you so much. As announced, I think we have our esteemed guest here, Mr. Ahluwalia. Many thanks for joining us on this session, and I can say that's a true fanboy moment to be talking to you on this stage. So I'll quickly get on to our discussion. I think one of the key questions, Mr. Ahluwalia, and you have been on the stage of of our planning commission and looking at it, what the global south has been doing on the question of sustainability and climate change. India's has made a commitment for net zero by 2070, but we also need to balance it with sustained economic growth. We, of course, are still not in the league of the developed nations in terms of our income, etc. So, as a developing nation, how do you envision India achieving the 2070 net zero target while maintaining a robust economic growth? Particularly given the global north putting pressure on cutting emissions more rapidly. What strategies or sectors you believe can help balance this trade-off between achieving net zero and achieving economic growth?
Well, thank you. Nice to be here, and thank the organizers for inviting me. We are competing with lunch, so we should be brief. So I'll try. Now, the question that you raised, how do we reconcile economic development with sustainability, is very important. There's no question that at our income level, which is actually pretty low, I mean, $2,700 or something like that per capita, we need to be much higher, okay? Now, that requires acceleration of growth, and I'm assuming that there's a huge range of things we need to do to get that growth rate up. And I think what the government, at least the Niti Aayog, put out some paper that if in order to achieve the objectives of Viksit Bharat, India needs to grow somewhere between 7 and 10%. Now, this is a range, so somewhere in between is like 8.5%.
Yeah.
We have not grown at 8.5%. I mean, the last 10 years, our average growth rate is about 5.6%. It was a little higher in the previous 10 years, but I'm not making that point. And there were many things that prevented high growth in the last 10 years. I mean, COVID and the war in Ukraine, etc. So first point is we need a whole range of things to get from where we are to where we want to be. That's outside our discussion, but it's very important. The real question is, if we can do that, what does this imply for sustainability? And the concern there clearly is that nobody denies that to grow you need energy. And usually energy involves, at least with the present composition, a certain amount of emissions. And we don't want the emissions. Actually, we've said we want emissions to go to zero by 2070, which is a very good objective, okay? So I think we have to recognize that two things we have to do. Number one, much greater emphasis on energy efficiency, so that the energy you need for any given GDP is much less because you've increased energy efficiency. But however much you increase energy efficiency, you will still need energy. Now, if you want emissions to go to zero, the only way you can do that is to move to energy sources that don't involve emissions, which basically means moving out of coal, moving out of other fossil fuels into renewable energy. Now, that process has kind of just about begun. not just in India, but around the world. I think somebody said in the previous session that India is not on track to hit 2070 net zero, and almost all countries are not on track. So the whole world has to focus on this issue. Now, are we likely to do it? That's really what we need to discuss. What is the scope? And here I would like to emphasize one thing. This will only happen if technology changes. It's not going to happen if we continue using the technologies we have or even just marginally altering them. Now, the good news is that the early news about technology, we are now able to think of renewable energy as a feasible alternative much more than, say, 10 years ago. But it's still not complete. So that's where we stand.
You talk about the energy mix for India, and I think we were talking on the sidelines as well. Of course, renewable is an answer where we look at solar, wind, hydro, with along with storage options. Nuclear is also in the mix. Any thoughts on that? How did that be leveraged?
Well, certainly nuclear, I mean, around the world, nuclear is in the mix. And India's nuclear energy contributes about 3% of the total electricity we produce. France is 70%. Even the United States is much higher. So there's no question that we should
United States, I think, is about 25%.
Yeah. So, we are ridiculously small. And unless we say that the rest of the world can use nuclear energy and we can't, we should be planning on, because it is, as you say, zero emissions. There are cost aspects, but hopefully with technology that will also improve. But I think the big thing on nuclear energy, which people talk about, is the growth of small modular reactors. That essentially will allow the manufacture of these reactors to be, as it were, not customized, but made factory floor things. So all kinds of parts and components can be standardized. I think we should look at that. There is new technology, but I've written about this saying that this should have high priority in India. But there are two things we have to do. If you want more nuclear with private sector involvement, and I'm quite clear that we should, you will have to review the current nuclear liability law, which is completely unacceptable to any private sector guy. We put a larger burden on any private sector person engaged in the nuclear power chain than anyone else in the world. Right. That's one. But second, if you want private sector involvement, you have to change the law to allow private sector people to actually operate the power plant. We have modified it to allow them to do non-power plant activity, but we don't allow them still to operate the power plant. Now, if new technology is coming with small nuclear reactors, it's very unlikely that any of these people are going to come in here if they're not even able to allow to operate the power plant. Now, these are big constraints. So if we want to do that, industry should raise this issue with government that, look, we're willing to push for this, and some of our larger industries would be able to tie up with the kind of people who have the technology, but this needs to change.
Definitely. I think action for both the public as well as the private sector here. Maybe I'll just step back, Mr. Ahluwalia. Dr. Ahluwalia, you have been an economist all your life. I think, we look at core GDP growth as a metric of a nation, developing and growing rich. With, the focus on climate and sustainability, when you think of, our GDP model, how does that capture it for a transitioning economy? There is a cost of, air pollution or water pollution that happens as we grow in our classical, growth models that we have seen in the Western world, and replicating that in India for a transitioning economy. Is there some other way that we should look at economic growth or growth per se when we think of, focus on climate and sustainability?
Well, first of all, by the way, I don't think people just talk about GDP. For years, people have been saying GDP is necessary, but it's not enough. So let me say quite categorically that at $2,700 per capita, anybody who says you don't have to grow, you should think of other non-GDP ways of improving your welfare. There are ways of improving your welfare, but at $2,700 per capita, you remain a joke internationally. So, either make up your mind. If you want to be taken seriously, we should, look, China has a per capita GDP of something of the order of $13,000 dollars per capita. So it's quite reasonable for us to say that, look, GDP has to grow. But it's not enough. I mean, merely GDP growing and not doing enough on health, or not doing enough on education, or allowing biodiversity to disappear, allowing water to be polluted, that's a disaster. But I think that's well known. And I mean, also the remedies are well known. The trouble is they're extremely difficult, and therefore nobody wants to take them.
I understand. Maybe a separate question on the focus on urbanization. I think again, the classical growth model has always been that, cities have been the centers of economic growth. And again, when we look at climate and sustainability as a metric, and we see cities in India, we have issues of congestion, we have issues of environmental stress in cities. Is there a need to rethink how should we grow as India over the next 20, 30, 40 years? Is there a super distributed model that we should look at? What will be the right incentives or the drivers for that as we think of our growth in an environmentally sustainable way?
No, I think you make a very, very important point, because there's been a tendency in India to think of urbanization in terms of the expansion of metros. That's a disaster. We do not need another group of cities with something of the order of 20 million people in them, which is more than the population of almost 100 and something of the United Nations countries. But urbanization we certainly need. What we need is a much greater expansion of cities, which are currently called the second and third tier cities, because they are large enough to provide, if you like, urban facilities and amenities, which we need in order to have industrialization. But everybody doesn't have to go to Delhi or Mumbai or Bangalore or Chennai. And that's what we really need to aim at. The idea that we don't need cities, I think, would be a mistake, because the economics of agglomeration are obvious. But, the economics of agglomeration do not need cities of more than, let's say, 1 million or 2 million in terms of people. In the rest of the world, there aren't that many cities that are more than 1 and 2 million. And, we've got 3 or 4 which are mega cities and very few in the kind of next range. That's what we need.
Yeah. Maybe a similar question on this lines, as you mentioned. I think we have, of course, states which are leaders in economic growth. Maharashtra, Tamil Nadu, who have grown significantly fast and now are actually higher than the national average, whereas other states have lagged behind. How should we think of incentivizing the right models for them so that they again grow in a more economically sustainable way? And also don't have lesser impact on the environment as we go forward?
Well, some of the incentivizing has to be done at the national level. I mean, for example, major connectivity to ports, railway lines, that kind of thing. But the rest of the incentivization must be done at the state level. Because, I mean, after all, if you're running a state and there's a big problem that none of your cities is livable, you can convert that into one of two problems. You can convert that into policies and land legislation and regulations that prevent development, plus resources. Now, as far as resources are concerned, we have the Finance Commission, which is meant to provide money to states that don't have enough money. But it's very important for the states not to use the money in freebies. They should be using the money to develop their own productive capacity. And you have to ask yourself the question, are they doing it? Now, I think the real political challenge is that and many states in the South are raising this issue, that if backward states use their money essentially in order to give freebies and don't do what is necessary to build productive capacity and therefore remain poor, should they continue to be subsidized for that purpose? I think it's a political explosive subject which is it's not actually being openly discussed, but it's there. And I don't think that the central government can afford to keep subsidizing states just because they are backward. The central government has a lot to do to protect climate change, some of which is connected, afforestation, better land management, better water management. I mean, water is going to be the biggest problem that India faces in the next 20 years. At independence, we had something of the order of, 5,000 cubic meters per person. And I'm told that around 1,700 is regarded as water stressed. And the average now is down to 1,300. And by the way, some parts are really at 600 and 700. So frankly, if the central government were to make a calculation, what does it need to do to ensure water security for the country? It would require a huge amount of expenditure. And that would take up a lot of available resources. Then you've got defense, you've got health, you've got education. And education, especially in a world where technology is changing, and I mean, all you gentlemen in industry keep saying that we don't have a sufficiently skilled labor force. I mean, this adds up.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's very insightful, Dr. Ahluwalia. Maybe now shifting towards our last segment on the private sector. I think we know what the policymakers need to do, maybe, or what they need to focus on. What is your message to the private sector? And there are like multiple entrepreneurs here, conglomerates here, who are building new businesses in the green transition. There are companies who are doing waste management. There are companies who are into recycling. There are companies who are, developing technologies for carbon dioxide capture, etc. And there are conglomerates who want to leverage all this to make their core businesses greener. What is your message to the private sector? How do they accelerate this transition journey? What should they be thinking of? What should they be doing?
That's both a very good and a very difficult question. The only really good questions are the difficult ones. But I do think that the private sector has a very big role to play here. Okay. First, I think it's not generally realized how much structural change in policy making is going to be necessary in order to make this transition. I mean, remember, going from whatever it is to net zero, or going from an electricity system dependent 80% on coal to zero, this is a massive structural change. It's going to require policy changes at the central government level, at the regulatory level. And I think it's very important for the private, and now the private sector is being encouraged by the government to come into generation. I mean, nobody is saying, we'll do it all, leave it to us. If that's going to be the case, I think the private sector should take the initiative to lay out that these are the structural changes that are necessary. Let me just mention one. We will never achieve a transition to emissions-free energy unless we shift from coal to, let's say, renewables, solar, wind, etc. Solar and wind are intermittent. They can be stabilized a bit through batteries. That raises issues of cost. But in the end, the way the market functions has to be very different from the way it has traditionally functioned. In India, 80% of the electricity that is actually sold is sold on the basis of PPAs, actually more than 80%. In the US and in Europe, that's only 60%. Now imagine if we're going to shift to give that much more of a role to electricity trading, then prices are going to vary. What is the implication for electricity pricing? Should consumers be ready to have time of day metering? It's going to cost more electricity more to consume electricity at certain times than at other times. You need smart metering for that. Now, public needs to be made aware of it. Otherwise, people are delighted with time of day metering if you only lower the price in some periods. But lowering the price in some periods means raising it in others. So I think only the private sector can organize all this. And frankly, some of the difficult decisions need to be laid out. Otherwise, there will be too much of a tendency to assume that this can be done. So it's really the job of the private sector, in my view, to pose before the government that, look, the slogans are great, the objectives are great. We also like the fact that you're giving a big role to the private sector. But if you want to succeed, this is what you have to do. And I think today what happens is the private sector reacts. And it's good that the government is consulting. But reacting to what has been put forward is one thing. There's no reason why the private sector can't independently lay out that, look, 5 years from now, or even 10 years from now, This is what the electricity market should look like. You can hire people from around the world and you can tell the government this is what others are doing. What is Indonesia doing? What is Malaysia doing? I mean, you just heard from Eric Solheim what the Chinese have done. We need to know more. And I think you are in the perfect situation to let this be known. And think about what it should be 10 years from now. That's not controversial. Any criticism of current policy can be interpreted as controversial. But you can always say, look, this is great, we're making a start. But just between you and us, 10 years from now, this is where we need to get. And that is a major contribution. This will not be done within the government. Cannot be done within the government.
No, I think spoken like a true economist. I think we need more efficient markets, and it's the players in the market which make the markets more efficient. Any closing thoughts, Dr. Ahluwalia, before we close on this?
No, thank you for inviting me. Think about what I've said.
No, I'm sure. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your insights.